Alone, the hijacker stood gazing out of the back of the 727. $200,000 in cash tied tightly to his body with paracord. The frigid wind and the deafening roar of the jet engines only intensified his growing adrenaline rush. He scanned the night landscape as the plane flew at 10,000 feet over Washington state. He was familiar with the cities and landmarks on this flight path. He waited for the right moment. The right moment to take a leap. A leap into legendary status that would mystify and intrigue our society for over 50 years. The case of D.B. Cooper is the only hijacking case that remains to this day unsolved by the FBI. Let's take a look at this case, and the man who may very well be D.B. Cooper. Portland, Oregon, November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man going by the alias Dan Cooper purchased a one-way ticket for an afternoon flight to Seattle, Washington on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. He was well dressed in a suit and tie, carrying a briefcase, and was reportedly very polite. Cooper sat in the back of the plane. Shortly after takeoff, he handed the stewardess a note. The note read, "I have a bomb." He asked the stewardess to sit next to him. She asked to see the bomb, so Cooper opened the briefcase, revealing what looked like dynamite with some wires and a battery. He gave her his demands to relay to the pilots in the cockpit. His demands were 2 main parachutes and 2 safety chutes, as well as $200,000 in cash in a knapsack. He also demanded that dinner be served to the passengers and crew and requested that passengers not be told that there was a hijacking in process. He knew the flight would take longer than it was supposed to. The airliner remained in a holding pattern over Seattle while the FBI was getting the cash and trying to find some parachutes. Stewardess Tina Mucklow stated that Cooper was drinking bourbon and soda and smoking cigarettes. He was smoking a brand called Raleigh cigarettes. This will have significance later in the story. Mucklow also noted that Cooper had donned a pair of horn-rimmed sunglasses shortly after he made her aware that he was hijacking the plane. When the FBI finally obtained all of Cooper's demands, Flight 305 touched down in Seattle. The plane taxied to a part of the airport far away from the main terminal. It would be refueled with the fuel truck positioned precisely where Cooper had specified. The cash and parachutes were brought on board, but the knapsack that he had requested the money in was not a knapsack at all. It was a bank bag which did not have the shoulder straps that he needed to be able to jump out of the plane with. He was very upset about this because it would make his plan a lot more difficult to execute. It may have been a deliberate attempt by the FBI to foil the heist. It has also been said that the FBI tried to stall him by saying the fuel truck had vapor lock and therefore was taking longer to fill the plane. This was just a lie that further agitated the hijacker as he wanted to be back in the air by 5 o'clock. After what seemed like an eternity, the jet was finally topped off with fuel. Cooper let all of the passengers and crew off of the plane except for the pilots and stewardess Tina Mucklow. She would relay messages to the cockpit for the hijacker via the interphone. The passengers thought the delay was due to a mechanical issue with the aircraft. None of them ever knew that they were being hijacked until they got off of the plane and were debriefed by the FBI. Nor could they accurately identify Cooper because he was sitting behind them the whole flight. Once back in the air, Cooper instructed the pilots to fly at 10,000 feet, with the flaps set and landing gear down, at a speed of not more than 200 miles per hour and fly to Mexico City. Cooper knew that having the flaps and gear down would ensure that the pilots would not be able to fly the plane faster than he wanted them to. The pilot told Cooper that with the plane in that configuration, they would not be able to make it to Mexico City without refueling. The pilot said, "What about Reno?" Cooper replied, "Reno sounds nice." It is now obvious to us that the destination of the plane was not important to Cooper. He planned to jump out before they would be able to land at any airport. The Boeing 727 was unique in that it had an aft-mounted retractable stairway. It was reported that the gentleman going by the name of Dan Cooper made it a point to verify that the plane was a 727 when he bought his ticket at the ticket counter. The aft-mounted stairway in the tail of the plane would allow him to jump safely out of the back of the jet. Cooper asked Tina Mucklow to lower the stairs for him, but she was afraid she might get sucked out of the plane. So instead, he just got her to tell him how to do it, and then he told her to go in the cockpit with the pilots and not to come out. The last thing Mucklow saw Cooper doing was cutting off cord from one of the parachutes and trying to strap the money bag to his body with it. This is the actual chute that he was cutting from. A little after 8 p.m., on that dark and rainy night, the pilots felt a pressure and pitch change of the aircraft as Cooper lowered the aft stairs. They don't know exactly when he jumped. All they knew was that when they landed the plane in Reno, Cooper was not on it. The FBI claims that he jumped into the vast wilderness of the Northwest and probably didn't survive. It is my opinion that Cooper probably stood in the doorway for a while looking out the back of the plane and observing landmarks so that he could jump out and land where he wanted to, which I imagine was closer to civilization and perhaps near a predetermined rendezvous point with an accomplice. Despite exhaustive search efforts by police and FBI, there was no sign of the hijacker. They even used military jets and an SR-71 Blackbird to search for Cooper. All to no avail. So who could this DB Cooper possibly be? Vietnam, 1967, Warrant Officer Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. had already done his first tour as a Green Beret for the United States Army. He was specialized as a demolitions expert and extremely well trained in all forms of combat as well as survival. Green Berets are an elite special forces group of very intelligent, highly skilled, and fearless warriors, specializing in unconventional guerrilla-style tactics, which they execute by air, water, and land. As part of their training, all Green Berets are airborne qualified. After his first tour, he completed helicopter training at Fort Rucker, and went back to Vietnam for a second tour as a chopper pilot, flying gunships with the Air Cavalry Troop, 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. McCoy received the Purple Heart Award in 1964 during his first tour, after being hit by grenade shrapnel. Then in his second tour as a pilot, he flew a volunteer mission to support friendly forces. In very poor visibility, while using only his instruments and radio to navigate, McCoy was able to locate the compound that was about to be taken over by the enemy. He then came under automatic weapons fire. He was able to use his entire payload of rockets to precisely annihilate the enemy Viet Cong positions and save the compound. For this he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He also received the Army Commendation Medal for heroism for rescuing pilots of 2 other helicopters that had crashed in a hostile location. In addition to flying a multitude of heroic combat missions, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. went above and beyond for his platoon and excelled in every task presented to him. His leadership skills would not only prove worthy for the military functionality of his fellow soldiers, but also for their spiritual well-being. He led a religious group in his free time that was reported by his superiors to have greatly improved the morale of the men. When McCoy came back home to the U.S. after his second tour, he joined the National Guard as a helicopter pilot. He was also enrolled at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, studying law enforcement so that he could obtain his dream job, which was to fly helicopters for the police. His pay with the National Guard was a mere $245 per month. Barely a sufficient wage to support his wife and 2 small children. McCoy was a devout Mormon, and he was also a Sunday school teacher. People that knew him well claim that he was the type of guy to give the shirt off of his back to help you. When he had the money to afford it, McCoy would go skydiving in his free time. Researcher Dan Greider has spent the last few decades researching the DB Cooper case. In his YouTube documentary, he looks at McCoy's actual logbook from his jumps. He reveals that in the months of August and September preceding the DB Cooper hijacking, McCoy did 8 practice jumps. Then immediately after the hijacking, there were no jumps recorded at all, until 5 months later when he logged another practice jump. The jump took place just before United Airlines Flight 855 was hijacked on a flight from Denver, Colorado in almost the exact same way as was done previously by the still-at-large D.B. Cooper. It seemed apparent to investigators at the time that D.B. Cooper must have struck again. The hijacker this time went by the alias James Johnson. He boarded the 727 during a stopover in Denver on a flight that was headed from New Jersey to Los Angeles. Once again, reportedly finely dressed, only this time he was using a hand grenade and a pistol to achieve his demands. He told the crew to fly to San Francisco where he wanted $500,000 and 4 parachutes brought to the plane while it was refueled. He then instructed the pilots to fly at 16,000 feet while following a pattern of waypoints that would lead the plane in a zigzag over Utah. Johnson instructed the crew to stay in the cockpit. After they passed the last given waypoint, one of the crew peeked into the cabin and saw that Johnson was gone. When the story hit the news the next morning, a friend of McCoy's called the authorities and said they thought it may have been him. Some friend. The FBI located McCoy immediately after the tip. They had to wait for him to land because he was flying a helicopter for the Utah Air National Guard participating in a search for the hijacker of Flight 855, who ironically was himself. Richard McCoy had managed to hijack a plane for $500,000, jump out of it, and make it to work the next day. When questioned by the FBI, he was very cooperative, but denied any involvement. They took fingerprints and a sample of his handwriting, then let him go home. McCoy had instructions for his demands on typewritten pages, which were relayed to the pilots by the stewardess. One of the notes was handwritten, and he forgot to make sure he got it back. A handwriting expert from the FBI compared the note with the handwriting sample they had taken from him, and found it to be a match. They also pulled a fingerprint from a magazine on the plane that matched to his fingerprint. The FBI arrested McCoy at his home in Provo, Utah 3 days after the hijacking. They searched his home and found $499,970 in cash. He had used $30 to buy a milkshake at a restaurant near where he landed and to pay a guy there to drive him to his house. Richard McCoy was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for air piracy. When he was questioned on his involvement in the D.B. Cooper hijacking, McCoy denied it. His alibi was that he was home spending Thanksgiving with his family in Provo, Utah. However, a credit card transaction from McCoy, at a gas station next to the airport in Las Vegas, the week of the Cooper hijacking, would prove otherwise. His sister-in-law would later admit that she stayed home with the kids in Provo for the Thanksgiving holiday and weekend while Richard McCoy and his wife Karen went on a trip. She says they told her they were going to California. Why would McCoy try to keep this information from the FBI if he had nothing to hide? Probably because being convicted of both hijackings would mean he would have much less of a chance of being granted an appeal. Not to mention, it would add on even more time to his sentence. There are many congruencies in the 2 hijackings that can't be ignored. In the first hijacking, Cooper had to ask the stewardess how to lower the aft stairway. In the second hijacking, McCoy already knew how to do it because he had learned the first time. Both hijackers used flight plan sheets for their ransom notes and they both were reported to use the phrase, "no funny stuff." Many aspects of the Cooper hijacking were not made public by the FBI. For instance, McCoy directed the fuel truck to the same position, distance, and angle from the plane as did Cooper. This was not public knowledge. Some have argued that McCoy was not D.B. Cooper because Cooper was smoking and drinking and McCoy was a devout Mormon that didn't smoke or drink. Common sense might tell us that this was just part of his disguise. He also used this disguise in the Johnson hijacking along with a wig and makeup. I also find it compelling that the brand of cigarettes smoked by Cooper were not readily available on the West Coast because they were made in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is very close to where Richard McCoy was born and raised. The odds are, any packs of cigarettes he may have had, would have been this brand. In 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was clearing out some sand on the bank of the Columbia River on Tina Bar in Vancouver, Washington to make a fire pit when he found $5,800 of the bills with serial numbers matching the Cooper hijacking. When the FBI didn't give Cooper, aka Richard McCoy, the knapsack that he requested, he probably stuffed all the cash he could into his suit and tied the rest in the money bag to his body. The money bag probably came loose in the jump while he was free falling. Evidently, McCoy made it with the cash in his suit because that Christmas he flew his entire family back home to North Carolina and also put 4 new tires on his car. Losing most of the money on the first jump would explain why he wanted to do the second jump. The Cooper hijacking was done over the Thanksgiving holidays and the James Johnson hijacking was done over spring break. McCoy did both hijackings without missing a day of school or work. While rummaging through boxes at McCoy's mother's house, which is now owned by his son, Rick McCoy, Dan Grider found the actual parachute that D.B. Cooper jumped with. The parachute was customized when it was packed for Cooper during his hijacking. This customization is a smoking gun because it is somewhat like a fingerprint, so to speak. I'll put a link in the description to Grider's video where he shows it and explains the details. As for a motive, we know that McCoy was struggling financially. He was going to college to get a degree so that he could start a career as a police helicopter pilot. After returning from Vietnam, McCoy had been experiencing frequent migraine headaches. He went to the VA to seek help. Instead of offering medical help, they told him they would have to take away his helicopter license. This was going to make his entire dream fall apart. Richard McCoy had fought selflessly and valiantly in the Army for his country. When he needed help, he was let down and left with nothing. Tina Mucklow asked Cooper during the first hijacking if he was doing this because he had a grudge against Northwest Orient Airlines. Cooper replied, "I don't have a grudge against your airline, I just have a grudge." McCoy stayed in prison long enough for his appeals to be heard. When he finally heard back that they were denied by the Supreme Court, he broke out of the penitentiary. He recruited bank robber Melvin Walker and 2 other cons to help in his escape plan. They made a fake handgun from dental paste and commandeered a garbage truck. They drove the garbage truck right through the prison gates. Down the road a ways they saw an older couple getting into their car, so they brought them into their house and tied them up. They needed to get some regular clothes from them and steal their car. The husband was having chest pains, so McCoy got the man's medicine for him and made sure they were okay before he left. McCoy may have become a hardened criminal, but he wasn't cold-hearted. 2 of the cons got caught while on the run, but McCoy and Walker lived as fugitives for a short time. They robbed a bank and rented a house to use as a hideout. The FBI broke into the house and waited for them in the dark to come back. McCoy came home with groceries in his hands one night, and as soon as he got the door opened, he was shot at point-blank range in the upper chest near his left shoulder by FBI agent Nick O'Hara. They claim that McCoy shot first, but that is still up for debate. The FBI did not administer first aid to McCoy, and they did not allow the ambulance to pull up to the house until they were sure he was dead. A medical examiner stated that McCoy would have survived if first aid had been administered. Richard Floyd McCoy was D.B. Cooper. His kids knew this their whole lives. It is only now that they are willing to acknowledge it publicly. Their mother has passed, so now there is no worry that she will be implicated because she was involved. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was a good man and a war hero. Sure, he committed some crimes, but he never hurt anyone. The bomb on the D.B. Cooper flight was fake, the grenade on the Johnson flight was a dummy grenade, and the handgun was unloaded. Perhaps it was a mix of desperation and a need for adrenaline. His life was filled with the stuff that the best action movies are made of. His audacity and fearlessness allowed him to do some very remarkable things. Since he is no longer here to tell us about the hijackings and exactly what happened in the D.B. Cooper one, it will forever be retold as a legendary tale of mystery that will spark intrigue in the minds of those that hear it, for generations to come. Not only was Richard McCoy responsible for some of the most daring capers in U.S. history, but he is responsible for giving his all to stand up and fight for his country. Let us not forget the brave heroic actions of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. May he rest in peace. Thanks for watching, and if you liked this video, please like and subscribe.